particularly for transformations, there's confusion around accountability. There's confusion around who's accountable for training, who owns the change, who owns the success metrics, and who's accountable for actually achieving value. And our suggestion is that IT organizations, as the leader of some of the most transformative changes in the organization, really just need to staff this function well.
The pace of change has never been faster, and the rate of change failure has never been higher. As technological change accelerates, the missing piece of the puzzle is people, their expectations, emotions, behaviors, culture, habits, beliefs, and resistance. Adoption will fail if customers and users are not willing, able, or committed to these change outcomes. Joining me today to discuss how we can drive adoption and value from organizational change is AVP of Research, Carleen McCubbin. Carleen, thanks for joining me today.
Thanks for having me, Jeff.
I wanted to jump right into it. What is organizational change management, and why do we need to care?
Organizational change management, we're not completely reinventing a new concept here, right? Organizational change management has been around for decades, but it's also been failing for decades, right? There's that saying when we talk about Agile that working software has no value unless used. How often do organizations create new solutions that don't deliver the intended benefits? Right? And organizational change management isn't about getting to completion of a project or a program. It's about driving the intended outcomes at every step along the way, preparing the workforce to do it, driving that adoption, ensuring that the benefits are attained. And so organizational change management is how we change how we perform as an organization and the process to get you there.
Right, and so this is an area, as you said, that's been around for a while. How does our approach here and our kind of modern viewpoint differ from the traditional wisdom in this area?
Yeah, so traditional project management, or the way that it's executed, maybe not the way that it's intended, tend to align with our project management practices, right? So we have a project, we're going through the project and the execution. At the end, we'll tag on some change management. We'll do a communication plan. We'll tell people about it. We'll put some posters up. And that's what people call organizational change management, right? And then they hand off to the business owners and say, congratulations, you have this beautiful new solution.
Right.
And that's really not what change management is. That's basically just project closure. Mm-hmm. What organizational change management really means is we are starting the organizational change before the project is even approved, before we even know whether we're going to go through with the transformation. It's starting with understanding what are the outcomes we're going to try to achieve. How is it going to drive value? How are we connecting to the core stakeholders so we really understand why we're doing this? And before we even kickstart, we're winning the hearts and minds. And without commitment at the onset from all of the different stakeholders and users who are going to be impacted by this, we're not going to be able to right-size the investment, the connections throughout, right? And so organizational change management starts way before people traditionally think,
right,
before it's even prioritized as a project. And through that, we're thinking about not only the intake and prioritization of that project, there's elements and activities that you're going to do through your planning, through your implementation, all the way through long-term sustainment of that change.
So let's talk about that piece in a little bit more detail, because if we're starting early and this is not tacked on to the end, what are the different phases of organizational change management we should be thinking about?
Yeah, for sure. And this changes a little bit based on the size and scale of the project, right?
Sure.
So you can lighten these up or beef them up a little bit more. But what we're really advocating for is there's still 4 core phases in them, but they're all iterative, right? So it's not like we're going to have this big transformation, digital transformation project that we're going to just plan, build, run, sustain at the end of it. It's an ongoing loop of things, right? But where it starts is we start in that planning phase. And in that planning phase, what we are advocating is that you spend more time up front and resource up front the impact analysis, right? And it's not just the impact of do we do this or do we not do this, but what are all the elements of our organization that are going to be, changed as a result of this? Understanding that, making sure we're quantifying the benefits. And one thing that we really focus on in this new research is what does successful adoption look like, right? Not just what does successful project completion look like, but when people have adopted it, how does this change their metrics? How does this help us to achieve our goals? How will we know whether this has been successful through the impact that it's having, right? And so in the planning phase, we're doing all this analysis up front so that we know what we need in order to support the change going forward. Right.
Right. So it's solving the, kind of the long-standing issue of, sure, I put in change management. Oh, look, nobody adopted it. Right. Like it's how to make sure we get to that ultimate adoption. Is that fair?
Yeah, exactly. And knowing what that looks like too, because I think one of the things we're also guilty with when it comes to project management is you submit a project to me and I execute the project as requested. As you know, requirements are typically not so great. Value is clearly not defined. And so IT is getting work requests or project requests without fully having access to the rationale behind that. And so they're building based off half the information. Right. And so what this really necessitates is getting that information up front, which allows you to build better. It allows you to integrate better all the way through.
Yeah. So, it's interesting, and I'm piecing it all together, but one of the key insights that came out of this was about sustainment, and the sustainment phase being the place where you really get the most value. Talk to me about what comes together there.
Yeah, for sure. And for sustainment, what we're looking at is there's a couple different elements of sustainment, right? We're looking at how you empower your users, how you lead differently through this, how you incentivize the types of behaviors that you're looking for, how you're changing sort of the practices and work of the teams as well. Right? And so sustainment is something that I think people thought about at the very end, very end, and they handed sustainment off to the business, and they really didn't think about what it meant, right? How do we change the hearts and minds and behaviors of everybody interacting with this, right? So the sustainment phase for me, it's not the end phase, it's actually something you start right after preparation.
Right.
So once you've prepared, now we're thinking about what are the core change moments that matter throughout. How can we prepare people? How can we drive adoption in each of those core change moments that matter?
You mentioned, Carleen, that this doesn't have to be this monolithic effort where it's, every piece of it is so heavy, and that, one of the insights we saw as well is that this is not one size fits all. That this is kind of pick the pieces that work for you. How does that work in practice? What does that look like?
Yeah, for sure. So typically when you're looking at it, and again, you want to right size this at the beginning. Right? If you're doing this and the approach is scalable for full scale transformations through to your typical projects. But what we want to do at the beginning is understand again what the impact is, what the work effort is, what the number of stakeholders, the risk to the organization is, and then figure out how you want to lighten your process or where you want to focus your time and effort, right? For large scale transformations, what we want people to focus on is each project isn't something that you're doing OCM on, but we want to take more of a programmatic approach. So how do you bundle those work packages together and figure out how you can do ongoing change management or change and release as you go through, so that you're not waiting 3 years to get value, but you have incremental value throughout. And so whether the change is a huge transformation or it's a smaller project, what we really want to figure out at the onset is what are the key moments, and then govern or manage to those core moments.
So it's almost like an outside-in approach of how are the actual adoptees or end users going to be impacted, rather than looking at our actual project timeline. Is that fair?
Exactly. And I love when you're talking about adoption and the users themselves, right? Thinking about the different users that you have in your organization, right? I can't create a whole training program for everybody that follows the same piece. I always think about, she won't watch this, but I'm going to tell you a story about my mom. Social worker for many years, Noble Field, could not get her head wrapped around the new technology that was being delivered within their organization. For years, she kept saying to me, I don't know why I have to use this computer when I have a perfectly good notebook that I could take all my notes on.
Right.
And so when you're thinking about change moments, we can't think of the training programs or the adoption plan based on, our level of comfort with technology.
Right.
We need to think about those change moments from that outside in perspective, from who's going to be using that. Are they used to using technology? How does this change their work practices? Are they even close to a computer in their day-to-day work, right? And so knowing what those are really changes those moments that matter, because it's not what the project milestones are, it's how they're interacting with the technology or the solution that's been created.
So tell me a little bit about the role of IT and technology within OCM. Is this something that typically lives within IT? Are there multiple ways to do it? What's the best way to tackle that organizationally?
So interestingly, I think this is actually one of the core challenges with traditional organizational change management as well. In our project management group, they have sort of an ongoing joke that's like, if you don't know who's accountable for OCM, it's probably you. Right. People probably think it's you, right? Because a lot of times people don't resource they resource the project, they don't resource the change.
Right.
Right? And this is a fundamental change that we need people to think differently on. Particularly for transformations, you need to staff that transformation and the change team and that element of it. And typically there is this chasm between what people think IT is responsible for and what the business users think they're responsible for. And as a result, there's confusion around accountability. There's confusion around who's accountable for training, who owns the change, who owns the success metrics, and who's accountable for actually achieving value, right? And our suggestion is that IT organizations, as the leader of some of the most transformative changes in the organization, really just need to staff this function well, right? And as a result, they'll see better outcomes.
Right. So we talk about change management in the context of project management, right? Mm-hmm. And adding change staff to, project management staff. To what degree are these, different fields and different teams versus, it's kind of one, holistic group that, maybe has a different focus? How do you kind of conceptualize that?
Yeah, so it can actually be both. So you can have organizational change management existing in different pockets within your organization. If you have a traditional, say, plan, build, run organization, it'll look very different than if you're in, say, a product delivery model, right? Where in product, you may have roles in your organization or as part of your team that are accountable and own the delivery and adoption of those products and services, right? And so how that manifests itself from a structure perspective can vary based on your org structure. But typically you have a close partnership with the project team, you have a close partnership with your service organization. And I personally, where we see this most successfully is when it's CIO sponsored. So if you have a strategy office or a deputy CIO office, we often see OCM falling in that category because we're talking about organizational change. We're not talking about project change, right? And so typically, particularly for transformative changes and large-scale transformations, we are seeing that closer to the CIO.
My sense is that the best companies are the ones that have this built out as a function, right? They have a change team. Mm-hmm. But for everybody else, it's like, well, crap, I don't have a change team, right? So it's more like the interesting part is more how you get from A to B, right? Is that fair?
I think so.
Yeah.
I think what makes it interesting is the accountability shift. So organizations who at least have people who are accountable for this,
right,
and who are measured on the value of the outcome, not on the project completion. That's really the differentiator, I'd say. Because if you're metriced on time, on budget projects, then you're never focused on the true adoption rates or the true value or making sure it's used properly. And so this creates a negative tension between what people are trying to achieve, right? Where I'm no longer incentivized to create and sustain that product or program. I'm done my project, I'm washing my hands of it, right? And so there's this stressor between those two realities.
Do you need both of those? Do you need a project team? Like, is someone still responsible for on time, on budget, and then someone else is responsible for the actual adoption and implementation,
so that's why they should be parallel streams, right? And so the adoption and the value should inform like the project goals and the requirements and all those sorts of great things. But your organizational change team, their function is on driving ongoing value from it. Right. Versus you still need somebody who's going to make sure you're getting things done on time, on budget.
So the tension you see between those metrics, that's a healthy tension. Yes. That's actually desirable between these groups.
Exactly. Yeah, we call those sort of tension metrics. Yeah. Right. So you have one on each side to make sure that you're succeeding.
Joining us today on our panel, we have AVP of Research, Carleen McCubbin. We've got Principal Research Director, Amanda Matheson, and we've got Research Director, Brittany Lutz. Thank you, everybody, for being here. I wanted to jump right into it. So organizational change management, we talk about this as something that just can't be communication at the end of a project. It's something that needs to be baked in even before projects start. And so I wanted to ask, if this is something that's kind of coming in midstream, can that work for a project? Can you say, okay, let's start thinking about change? Or, have the horses kind of left the barn, so to speak, and, better luck next time? Amanda, we were talking, just a little bit earlier about that. What's your perspective?
Well, if the horses have left the barn and there's no fence, good luck. So here's the thing. Change has a memory in organizations. And part of that planning process, where we're thinking about what are we going to do next, or what Carlene was referring to earlier around before the change even starts, I think you need to think about what is your history with change in the organization. Because if it's not been good, you're not starting neutral, you're starting at a negative. And so there will need to be some more change activities. Can you get the horses back to the barn? Yes, but you're going to need more people. You're going to need more resources, which are above and beyond your people, so more tools, more templates. And you're going to have to lean into resources that you probably haven't leaned into before, because they like their freedom and they probably don't want to come back.
Carlene, do you agree with Amanda?
I mean, I think in principle, I think she's correct, right? Like, if the change has already started, it is harder to pick it up midstream and try to rectify the situation, right? But there are ways to do it. It starts with empathy. It starts with understanding the scenario, the players involved, any sort of resistance to that change, and then taking an active step and public step on what are you going to do next? How is it going to change? How can you be more transparent throughout? And so when a change has started off rough, I think you have to focus on that correction by focusing on the people and on the transparency of your next steps. And so when you do that, I really do think you can get, maybe it's that optimism in us, but I do think you can get a change back on track and continue to deliver value. Because the other thing is that change never ends.
Oh, yeah.
Right? And so if I'm saying, I'm not going to try to get this back on track, it is what it is, go forth, you could be in the middle of this for years. So now you've just given up on the success of a whole program, right? So get it back on track, figure out what's going on, and really focus in on that transparency.
Well, and the biggest part with change is it should be iterative. If you create a plan for change and things aren't working the way you planned, that doesn't mean you just scrap and say, well, next time we'll do better. It's, okay, this isn't working. What could we do differently this time? What is it that we need? Do we need our leadership to speak up more frequently? Do we need to make sure that people understand the end result we're working towards? Do we need managers to have regular meetings with their staff and explain the change and more day-to-day or week-by-week outcomes, right? So don't just think because you didn't have change at the beginning or because the change plan you had is changing itself that you need to stop and throw your hands in the air. You need to keep going, and you need to start identifying other ways you can make this successful.
So, but coming back to, before you can even get back into change processes, trust has been broken. And it is about stepping back and building up that trust, building up that credibility again. And there's a fair amount of vulnerability that needs to take place in those leaders. Over 80% of employees want to hear about change from their direct managers. And, everybody does surveys, engagement in employee sentiment, whatever. What is your organization's surveys telling you about the relationship with the frontline leaders? So, because if you want to get change back on track, you almost need to go back and make sure that there is trust. And if it is broken, how do you recover from that? And then build a plan that goes beyond emails and town halls and create some initiatives to the front line so that you're communicating through them as well.
So I thought, that's a really interesting stat, and it's not one that I would have known kind of intuitively. And I'm curious, what's the interplay there between needing to have, the frontline managers be the ones communicating change and the risk that comes from diffusing that change messaging, right? Because every time you add one more communicator of change, you risk losing the message, right? It just kind of becomes broken telephone. But is this just a case of, the juice is worth the squeeze, you have to find the right way to do it? Or, is there a balance or a trade-off here?
I think it's a cascade. And I think each level of leader, including the sponsor, has a role. And I think that it's all different. So the larger organizational pieces, again, in the planning, that cascade is very intentional around, this is what the senior leader will say, this is what the sponsor will say, this is how the managers follow up after those announcements have come out.
And I think too, you don't just send people in, out to the wolves themselves, to continue with our animal themes here. I mean, the frontline leaders or whoever is delivering that message, bring someone from the change team with them so that they are supported in that change, so that they can answer any questions, but also so that change team can hear what is the feedback that we're getting, what are the concerns that we're hearing, and adding that to a central repository or FAQ. This will drive not only comfort with the change, but also a little bit more trust and faith in that change team as well, so that they are exposed to what's happening, right? Because it really is a leadership position that you're talking about here.
Well, the CIO or whoever is sponsoring that change is usually the one who should be coming forward and announcing what the overall change is for the organization. But the manager is the one communicating what's the impact to me personally day to day as a person in this organization, right? And I would never expect the CIO to know every single what's in it for me for every single person in their organization. That's where you need to lean into your managers.
Right. So it's an and, not an or. We're not saying senior leadership should not be communicating the message. We're saying we need to have a fast follow plan to make sure that there is that direct conversation happening.
Yeah.
And I think this also depends on the type of change. Like, we're talking about rolling out a new system. We've taken away Explorer. Now you have to use Edge. Like, there's different versions of what's going to happen when you're talking about a change, because there may be, who you bring to those meetings may be slightly different depending on who's doing the training, who is going to answer those questions. So again, there's no one size fits all approach, and it also depends on how emotional of an impact this change is going to have. If I'm announcing your job is going to change and now all of a sudden, like, your team structures, that's a very different message than me saying that, we're going to a system upgrade, where your objection in that may be one of, skill sets, or it may, rather than will or a concern about your own, status in the organization, right? So understanding that is really important as you're leaning into.
Yeah, and that's what I love about one of our tools, because it clarifies the impact level and goes through, to what degree is this impacting on a time scale or on a personal scale? So is it the skill sets? Is it something that needs to be done every day? Is this something that's done once a month? Is it impacting the team? Is the team changing? Is your leader changing? So all of those questions are in that diagnostic, which really help you figure out what is the impact, because then you can figure out, how am I scaling this? Because it feels big when you're looking at everything, and it doesn't need to be everything.
Well, and that's going to change person to person, right?
Exactly.
So applying a one-size-fits-all approach will never work with change management. You need to constantly be saying, how are you making out? How's things going? You've learned a new system. Are you enjoying it? What don't you enjoy about it? Versus, well, I'm happy you enjoyed it. We're going forward and just going to keep pushing with it. You wanted more training, or you wanted to see how some of your peers use it. Great, let's get you an hour set up with one of your peers so you can see how they use the new system, right? So I think we really need to make sure that we're not just trying to force this change and assume, okay, they're using it, so therefore we're successful. Are they using it to the standard that we were trying to get them to? Are they actually enjoying it? Did that resolve or create a better experience with the digital? Okay, those are the outcomes we wanted.
Yeah.
Difference between compliance and commitment.
Yes, change management is not a check mark exercise.
Right. So to what degree is OCM cultural when it comes to getting it adopted? Do we need to make sure there's that kind of top-down buy-in of this is important? And if we don't have that culture, is there something we can do to still shore up the experience and the adoption and value?
So I do think there is cultures and organizations about how they like to communicate. And particularly, you'll see differences in different industries based on different sizes. Startup organizations have a very different communication or OCM policy than more established organizations, right? I've even heard people say water cooler is our communication channel of choice.
Right.
So they got into a lot of trouble when they got into COVID and the water cooler disappeared. But it does have to be something that's sponsored at different levels in the organization. And I think that's where you have to make sure that the rigor you're applying is appropriate for your organization. So organizations who don't understand the value of OCM are probably going to invest less in it. So you really have to make sure you're focusing on the right level of rigor for the complexity of the project and the investment you're putting into it. It is harder to justify buy-in on smaller level projects, I would say, for organizational change management, true OCM, than it is for a transformation, right? And so if I were starting off and we had a culture that OCM wasn't super important to our leadership team, I would make sure I'm anchoring that around a specific transformation, why we need it, when we need it, in order to make sure that's coming through, and making sure that those adoption measures, not the project measures, the adoption measures, are connected back to organizational objectives and outcomes so that it's clear across the organization why you're doing this and what you're trying to drive.
Well, when we look at the management and governance framework that we have here at Infotech, change management is one of our core processes. And for our members who've done the diagnostic, change management came out 42nd out of 45 in terms of effectiveness. So that means that we are just terrible at change management when it comes to IT. Yeah. And that's coming from the IT departments themselves. They understand that this is not something that they're putting a priority in and that they're able to do effectively. And I think this is a really great opportunity for us to say, we're going to be the change makers going forward. Organizations are going to depend on every single change, kind of leaning into some form of technology going forward, whether we're changing the organization or having a change happen internally for IT. Mm-hmm. So we have to get that to become a stronger process for IT if we're going to move forward.
Mm-hmm. I completely agree with that. And I think the funny thing is that it's 42 in terms of effectiveness, but it's actually pretty easy. It's like if you implement the right processes, if you think through it, if you resource it, if you start with people, if you understand impact, none of those things that I've just described are, neuroscience or super complicated. They're just things that people don't invest the time and effort in.
Yeah.
And they're really easy, right?
Exactly, because as soon as you start, we talk about change in terms of starting it before your project plan. And so often you have that high-level project plan or even a portfolio plan for the different pieces. Well, where's the change management that's let's just do a quasi-impact, figure out who the stakeholders are, get them to the table, figure out, you can then scale it as you're building. So that's starting before the planning. Mm-hmm. And then when you've got it approved, and you also have some idea on even maybe we're going to stage this differently. Mm-hmm. So if you're looking at portfolio, we're going to do project A and then C, because A and B are huge change. They're going to need a bit of a break. Let's go to C and then do B after that. Give people some time to regenerate, right? Because there is a saturation level to the organization as well. But then the people change plan is part of the project plan. It's just a section. It's not its own plan somewhere else, and never the two shall meet. It needs to be connected. When you go through user testing, how is that showing up on the people side? Are you using your end users to do the user end testing? That's a great way to incorporate activities and incorporate a people change plan, is figuring out ways for involving the end users in the project process itself.
So we started talking about end users, and one of the, I think, perhaps complexities of dealing with technology organizations is that most of the transformational changes we're talking about are not just within the technology organization, right? That there may be led or developed or delivered by technology, but for, the broader organization. And so, my sense, and I've worked on a few of these in my past life, is that there can sometimes be this question of well, who actually is responsible for the change team? Where should they live? Mm-hmm. And, if you get into a little bit of trouble, that's not my job, right? Change management should live over there on the other side of the fence. Where is the right place for change management, and who really needs to be accountable for it in relation to, in IT, not in IT?
Well, right now we see that CIOs are poised to be the change makers of the organization. So 85% of organizations believe the CIO to be the change maker. So whether you're responsible or not, you don't have that opportunity to just throw your hands in the air and say, I'm not responsible for change. Your organization expects it from you. Therefore, you need to now step up and be a part of that. Do you need to do it alone? Absolutely not. There's tons of resources and support that you should be getting from HR. And then again, of course, leveraging the other areas of the organization and their leadership, right? You shouldn't be necessarily the one talking to marketing, but you need to make sure marketing understands the change. So we can definitely see a correlation where as transformations are happening more often in the organization, as change is becoming more technical, the CIO is being leaned on to be the change maker in the organization.
And I love your question, Jeff, because it connects back to what we're seeing along some of our exponential IT themes, where the services that we're providing are direct to customer, right? And we haven't historically done a great job of figuring out who owns those services,
Right.
let alone who owns the support of them, who owns making sure that they're accessible, that they're usable, that they're being used in the intended way.
That they create good experience.
Yes.
Exactly.
That they create good in the world even, right? And so I think that as the CIO, depending on the role of IT in the organization, the answer to your question is different. What do I think the answer should be, though, is also different. I think that IT leaders need to, if they are developing and delivering those digital services direct to end customer, they need to be accountable for that service experience, which includes making sure that it's usable, that people are trained on it, that they know how to get support, that it's communicated effectively so that people don't just go to the website and something that they were looking for is just gone, right? That has to all be part of this change and transformation team. And so as they are the ones delivering these projects, they are developing and accountable for the success of them, and they are too accountable for the change management elements of that.
Yeah. They're responsible and accountable for the portfolios and the projects within them. And so even if you are going to bring in some other people or change leads, having them part of that project plan, that means you're accountable for the entire plan. That includes the people side of it as well.
I would say, like, this doesn't abdicate responsibility for your business users, like, or your business stakeholders. If it is a project that they are the sponsor for, or is a change that is direct for their particular part of the organization, they of course also have shared accountability on this as well. And that sharing means that they need to define who's doing what, who's accountable for what, and how they together are going to partner on it, right? So I think that's the missing gap for a lot of people, is they don't take the time to define that accountability.
I would agree with that. Yeah, and the accountability piece is so hard because in the RACI, we always say it's one, but what we're talking about here is like who owns the project, who owns the change lead. I do think that one person is that project, is running the whole project. The responsibles might be different maybe.
See, I don't think it's the person who's running the project.
Okay.
Because I think the person who's running the project is accountable for project timelines, for project deliverables, for schedule, budget, requirements being fulfilled, all of the coordination of that project, which is a slightly different skill set that you would see for ensuring we're delivering value, understanding the impact, delivering the training. So I see these as parallel but connected streams.
Right, and as the project manager, it's still their job to make sure that those tasks are getting done, even if there's a stream owner.
So the project manager still is accountable for making sure tasks get done, but they don't own the development. They're not accountable for the development. They're not accountable for the requirements gathering, just as they're not accountable for the OCM. They want to make sure it's done, it's part of the project plan, but the OCM is a parallel stream.
Okay. I see. Yeah, no, I see where the thing, but it still is, because if we go back to Jeff's original question, and I'm glad because we always think about what does the R mean, what does the A mean, what is and I just spent a week with a group and we really fought through all of that. And a lot of your tension comes with somebody's being consulted or informed and they actually think they're the A or the R. So really getting those roles in place and really figuring out what is your project portfolio manager responsible for, and then what is what are your stream people responsible for to make sure that everything's delivered on time and at time. And I hate to say it, build in consequences. We're really good at delivering the technology and making sure the technology is delivered, but suppose the people change side. Oh, well, we didn't do this, and well, that's okay. Wait a second, it's not okay. That technology is finished and ready to go out the door before we go into our next sprint or next iteration, and the people side is missing. Do we have the guts to say stop? the barn door is open, to go back to your original.
Right. I think for CIOs, we've said there's a huge opportunity here to really take the lead in terms of, OCM, not just in IT, but across these kind of technology-enabled deployments. What happens if they don't? What's kind of the risk or the implication if they say, you know what, like, I'm a technology CIO, like, I'm not in it for all this people stuff, not my problem. What's the risk?
You'll be left behind. It's that simple, right? The organization's going to need somebody who's going to do that. So if you're not willing to step up, I think you'll be quick to be left behind, whether that means bringing in someone who will be that chief digital and information officer type of role and will lead the transformation, whether it's a chief transformation officer, there's going to be someone brought in who will lead the change. And that will not necessarily allow IT to have the say, to have the involvement, to be as active in the change as they probably should be.
Here's another take on that. Like, I agree with what you're saying, Brittany, but I mean, you might be left behind, but maybe you don't mind being left behind. The bigger risk I have is that you're investing tons of money in this transformation and nobody thinks it's a success but you.
Yeah.
Right? Because you've gotten it done and now your whole reputation is on the line for this transformation and nobody is happy with the releases. Nobody is seeing the value in what's being delivered. And so there's a huge reputational risk for the organization. There's an accessibility risk for the organization. And it could be ultimately career limiting for you as a leader within the organization. And so because many of these large scale transformations are technology led, I just don't think you have the option to sit on the sidelines.
You don't. Adoption. No adoption, no success.
Agreed.
Cool. Well, thanks everyone again for joining me today. This has been wonderful. I really appreciate the time.
Thanks, Jeff.
Thank you.
So walk me through maybe the methodology we have here as we build out an OCM process that's really going to work for the organization, create adoption, create value. What does that look like?
Yeah, so this is a cool one because it's interesting when you're building a project like this because it was sort of a chicken and egg thing, right? We're like, are we building the OCM process or are we applying the process to a specific change, right? Are we coming with one process and saying, apply this to your context? And since I love scope creep, we decided to do both. So what we looked at is we essentially started by creating what is your OCM playbook, right? So we went through and we created a standardized function of how are you going to manage through change based on different sizes of change, based on your org structure, based on the core outcomes that you need to achieve. So we start by going through basically setting up the guardrails for what OCM will look like in your organization and how it's going to function, improving that process. And then what we do is we take that and we immediately apply it. So we're saying, okay, let's take that conceptual idea and apply it in practice to a big transformation or change that's happening. So in that, what we'll do is we'll work with you on defining for that change, what's your overall change story? Building out your impact analysis, figuring out what that really looks like for you and your core messages. So let's use digital transformation as a theme as we go through this, just for simplicity. So in that, we'll figure out what's your digital change story, who's impacted by it, why are we doing this, how it's gonna help our organization to succeed, and really defining what those core measures and metrics are, right? Once we have that change story, we go into, that's part of our planning phase. Then we go into a little bit more of the preparation and execution and sustainment. When we do that, we'll start building out what your change team really needs to look at, like figuring out your accountability matrix, figuring out the communication plan, what your training plan is going to be, what your core releases and the communication and value points around that, and taking that and charting out who's going to do what, when are we going to do it, what are we going to say, to whom. So really practically figuring out how in our organization is this going to function for that one particular transformation. And then we pull that through to driving adoption. So we build out with you your adoptions metrics, your dashboard for that. So you can use that in ongoing projects and governance to say, okay, here's how we're tracking on each of these core factors, all the way through to figuring out what the sustainment plan is. So how are we going to incentivize on this? How will we empower users for this? Who are we going to get engaged in that? And so essentially we take each of the phases of the change and create the core artifacts required for success across.
Right. And so, you talked about this a little bit, but once you've kind of gone through this methodology, what, remind me, what are the artifacts that you walk away with? And do you walk away with, an OCM function basically?
Yeah, so what we walk away with essentially is your OCM playbook that you've now tested and improved based on a specific change that you're going through.
Right.
So you'll have both the playbook for a specific change that you're working on, as well as a repeatable process that you can use for other things going forward.
Right. How long does it take to get something like this off the ground?
Off the ground? I mean, listen, change takes time. It's something that we can do over a period of time, but ideally, when we can get a concentrated effort, we want to get people together, say in a room for 4 days over a workshop to really accelerate this process and really figure out how is this going to work for us going forward. So, I mean, it's something that you want to implement on an ongoing basis, but getting the foundations right, you can usually accelerate within a 4-day period.
Right. So, is this methodology something that, is it for people who have hired a change team and they're trying to figure out what they need that team to do? Or can you do it, without a change team, with existing roles? How does that work?
So I would say most people probably haven't hired that change team yet. Right? For most people, it's probably still fairly ad hoc in terms of what they're doing with change management. And while I do encourage people to think differently about change, and you do need some dedicated roles to support this, because Lord knows, it's a completely different skill set to manage and drive adoption, to do training than it is from your traditional skill sets, right? So I do think in time, as you're going through this, particularly in a transformation, you should hire roles for this. But in the meantime, you want to think about all these core artifacts. What is it you need to do? Which parts of this process that I've explained are valuable for you? And then figuring out who's going to be accountable for that on a change by change basis, or on a project by project or program basis, and kind of move forward that way.
Can you tell me a little bit maybe about, some of the organizations you've worked with and their, kind of OCM journey, how they, get from this kind of we've got nothing to building it out, and what that looks like? Yeah,
for sure. I mean, every project is different. I've got some horror stories and I've got some good stories along the way. Like one great example that I had of about maybe a change gone wrong. I was working with an organization. They'd been working on their CRM implementation for 5 years.
Wow.
They were investing millions of dollars in this, and they'd invested so much that they didn't know when to stop. The team didn't even know who the sponsor was anymore. Okay. And so they had completely lost sight of why they were doing this, who was impacted by this, right? Because they weren't connecting the project and getting to completion on the project with the actual change they were trying to get. Right? And this is like a complete divorce from change management and project management, where they were still working towards milestones, requirements that were done 5 years ago, and continuing to invest in something. And now that they had invested so far, they were going back. Right? And so you have organizations like that where they've completely divorced the two concepts. Organizations who do this really well, I was working with an organization on their implementation of a structural change. They've got 5,000 people in IT, and they're trying to figure out how to transition from their current state to their target state. Early on in this process, trying to think about it, like, so Carleen, do you think we could get this done in maybe like 1 to 2 months? I was like, let's think about this. Let's think about all the stakeholders that need to be involved. Let's think about the transition plans that need to be created, the conversations with your union that need to happen, right? And while we could potentially get the change going forward, you really need to think about all of those key milestones that need to be done. And if you're just looking at executing versus succeeding, there's a difference in that process. So instead of big banging it, they ended up creating a change transformation team. And that group met on an ongoing basis. They helped the organization to implement their structure layer by layer, working with all the union groups, the HR organization, crafting out all the new processes. And it did take time. This probably took 1.5 years to fully implement and get value from the new structure. But as a result of doing that, they were able to bring people along in the way. And they actually leveraged our employee experience monitor tool, which is basically a 1-question survey that goes out monthly to staff, right? And just to track how were people feeling about the transformation? How are they feeling about the change? And they were able to see, when we had this change announcement, engagement went up, engagement went down. Which groups did it go up on? Where did it go down? So they could course correct as they were going through. And so this allowed them to personalize their change experience really well. And organizations who can do that can actually get change champions from people who may have previously been detractors.
So I love that story of being able to get ahead of the curve and like really, figure out how we personalize this, how we customize it. I'm still reflecting on kind of the horror story version, which is like, my God, we're so far down the rabbit hole, like we don't even know which way is up. Is there, and I don't know the end of the story, but like, is there a road back from that? How do you, because I can imagine there's lots of organizations out there that could say like, oh yeah, that's exactly us. We're in that boat, but like now what? We're in it too late to start with OCM. How do you get back from that?
Yeah, and I think at that point, this is where change governance becomes really important. And governance isn't just an oversight function on this, but it's getting the steering committee back together and saying, okay, what is it we're trying to achieve at this point? Because we're not investing in the right place, right? And so at the outset, essentially what they needed to do was they needed to get back together with the people who were the owners of that project and that initiative to say, let's decide what we want to do going forward. Are we going to continue down this path?
Well, thanks, Carleen, for joining. This has been really insightful and interesting. And for everybody else that's interested in learning more about OCM and how to drive adoption and value, please check out our full blueprint at infotech.com.